Again, a warm welcome from the Academy. I think a number of you have engaged on courses before on the kayakkonnect.org platform. We're quite excited about this course. It's been a really interesting collaboration between the Institute for the Futures, which is based in Palo Alto, California. And they're a really interesting think tank, and I'm sure Jeremy will talk a little bit more about them. But it's been taking their methodology together with insights from a number of local partners in East Africa. We've worked closely with our team there, and together also with the Institute for Development Studies based out of Sussex University. So it's been a really good mashup between the academic research on global humanitarian trends. We've seen the UN climate report come out this week. We're seeing a number of natural disasters, etc., only increasing. But through this project, we've tried to see what are some of these broader global economic technology trends, signals, and disruptions, and try to see the correlations between the humanitarian ones and the broader ones. And in addition, the methodologies, the methods that Jeremy has introduced to this course will hopefully be interesting strategy tools as we look to plan for the future for the organizations that we work in. So that's just very briefly for me. I'll hand over to Jeremy, and we look forward to working with you on the rest of this course. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Atish, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm calling in today from Lagos, Nigeria, and I'm really excited to talk with you all about the future and foresight and how we can apply that to what we're doing here at the Institute for the Future in the humanitarian sector, and everything else that we're doing. Jem, if I could get that first slide up. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a innovator, a strategist, and sometimes lowercase e entrepreneur. I spend a third of my time here in Nigeria, a third of my time in China, and a third of my time in California, near Silicon Valley, where I'm from. And I'm constantly exploring different ways to think about the future and new emerging disruptions and signals that can inform people like yourselves and companies and organizations all over the world as they're doing their work, so that they can use the future in order to do their work better in the present. I work with Institute for the Future, which is a 50-year-old think tank based in Palo Alto, California. That's our 50th anniversary. And we are always focused on the future 10 years out and more. We choose the 10-year future timeline because it induces what our researcher Jane McGonigal calls urgent optimism. It's far enough out that we feel like we have power to change the future, but close enough in that we feel the urgency to do something about it. And in humanitarian futures, we're dealing with some of the most urgent problems on the planet. And they're not to be taken lightly. And we need powerful tools in order to face those problems more effectively. So we partnered with the Humanitarian Leadership Academy and our other partners in order to research what the most important focus areas are for humanitarian work in the next 5 to 10 years. And then Institute for the Future applied our methodologies in order to put a futures lens on that work as well. So all of you have been interacting with the MOOC in some way. And this webinar is a chance for us to interact with each other and for us to get to know each other a little bit better, to answer some questions you might have, and to work out some of the kinks in the ideas we've been thinking about. So I'm very excited for this and excited to be getting to know you all a little bit better. I'm especially excited to get to work with humanitarian professionals, and because it is so important that we have people who care so deeply about facing these challenges. Now, the unique challenge of humanitarian futurists is using futures in a specific way. And that specific way is thinking outside of your preferred future. It's very intuitive to use futures thinking in order to think about the future that we want and to build a plausible, internally consistent, provocative story of the future that is something that we want to see. Especially in humanitarian futures, it can be difficult to make the leap to also telling future stories that we don't want to see. And the reason it's so hard in humanitarian futures is because those negative stories can be so disastrous and they can involve such devastating consequences. But it's important that we consider them as well in order to build more resilient strategy and to provoke innovation so that we build a future in which those things do not happen. Jen, next slide. You've all been on the MOOC and have gone through some of the focus areas. And so I wanted to ask you to answer a quick poll, which is, what is the thematic area you've seen? And how does it resonate most with your current work? Now, we have 3 of these. We have famine and food insecurity. This is about global, it's related to climate change, as all of them are. This is about broken supply chains or broken economies contributing to long-term food insecurity or famine. We have natural disasters, which we have seen increasing year on year on year, and that we continue to expect to increase, that will cause new pressures on already stretched organizations to respond. And then we have displacement and protracted crises, which is about internal and international migration by force, and crises that are not going to go away, that are not going to be won or solved. So look at these and think about in your work what you've been working on and what affects you most. So it looks like natural disasters are resonating with a lot of people, and perhaps it's because natural disasters compound these other ones. And all 3 of these, of course, are arbitrary buckets. Not arbitrary. They're not mutually exclusive buckets. All of them influence each other, and they're not collectively exhaustive. There's many more problems beyond these. The reason why we create these categories, something that we might call future forces, is because it gives you a way to hang your story that helps you think about it in a more effective way. And we always do 3 to 5 different buckets, because we know from our friends in the neuroscience community that you can't hold more than 6 things in your mind at one time without dropping one. And so we try and aim for at least a maximum of 5 different future forces. 4 is better than 5, and 3 is better than 4. I see a few questions coming up in the webinar in relation to what I'm saying. So before I move on to the next section about signals, I want to make sure that I am addressing them. Let's see. Just going through. Right. So Ole asked, what do you mean by most, in quantity or quality? You can't measure it just like that. Regarding which first question, regarding about which thematic area resonates most with your current work. And this is an important question because it addresses what kind of methodology Foresight is. Foresight is a qualitative method for analyzing the world. It's not meant to be used in replacement to quantitative methods. When we were building the 5 to 10 year storyline about these three categories, we used a lot of quantitative data on demographics, on weather, on sensor data about natural disasters, and rigorous academic definitions around those. Foresight is a qualitative method because it is used to think about things that don't have good data yet. If you have long historical data with a consistent trend that you can track over time, Foresight is not the appropriate methodology. But when we're thinking about the future, there are many things that are too new to have good data about them. When we're thinking about something like blockchain or new funding models or new ways of applying big data in intelligent ways, sometimes these methodologies don't have enough data to use statistics and to use change in an effective way. And that's when Foresight comes in, because even though we don't have rigorous data, we still need a useful way to think about these things so that we can take advantage of them in an innovative and resilient way. Jem, next slide. So I want to talk about signals. Signals are core to our methodology of thinking about the future. And signals you can think about as William Gibson said, next slide, Jim. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And what he meant by this was, and the way that we think about this is that the future is here all around us if you just look for it. And by gathering these pieces of the future all around us and looking at them and finding them and thinking about them in an effective way, you can use them to plan for the future and to prepare for the future. This is core, and a signal is easy to understand but very specific. The second part of a signal is that, and I've started using this as well, is a motto that I heard from Andela.com, which is a technology startup that is based in Nigeria, New York, Kenya, and I think they're now in Rwanda. They say brilliance is evenly distributed. So if we take those two facts, that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed, and the fact that brilliance is evenly distributed, we know that wherever we are, we can find pieces of the future all around us. So what's different about a signal from a trend or a disruption? A signal is something very specific. It's something that can be a story or a new product or a behavior from your children or something you saw on the street. It's very specific. For instance, Internet of Things is not a signal. It has been raining more is not a signal. Both of those things are very important. They're just not signals. One of them is maybe a force or a trend. The other one is data-driven. Signals are something that you see that makes you go, that's different. And no single signal can be used to do foresight, but if you take many signals and you gather them, and then you cluster them, and you use them as a tool to think about the future more effectively, then you're able to tell a story about the future that connects back to the present. And this is very important because eventually we were using foresight not to tell a story that ends in the future, but a story that ends in the present here. Because if we tell a future story that ends up being 100% correct, but it didn't change the way that we behaved today, then we failed. If we tell a future story that ends up being completely wrong 10 years from now, because it changed our behavior today and it made us build a future that was better than that, then we've succeeded. So that's our goal today, is to start thinking about how we can do that. I wanted to walk through with you a few signals, since we are all here talking about it together. And there's a couple that I've prepared, and then a couple that other people have shared as well. So, Jem, if you could go to the first signal, yeah. So camp, camp.net is based in Ghana, in Accra, in a section of Ghana called Agbobloshi, which is one of the most polluted areas on the planet. It's an e-waste dump. So e-waste comes from all over the world to be dumped in Agbobloshi. This is old computers, old cell phones, any kind of electronic. And the place is also a mine. There's a lot of people there mining these old electronics for copper and plastics and other materials. And the way that they currently do it is very unhealthy and sometimes dangerous. The amount of heavy metals, poisonous heavy metals in the ground there are some of the highest in the world. However, there's not a lot of incentive, because so much money is being made there, there's not a lot of incentive to clean the processes. A lot of people say that they should get rid of Agbobloshi, they should get rid of the e-waste dump. But CAMP has another view on that. They think that they should take what is currently a $100 million industry, make it cleaner, and make it a $1 billion industry. Because we all need e-waste process. So it's not about getting rid of this, it's about changing it in some way. And their idea for doing that is leveraging the innovative practices that people are already doing. People there are already taking e-waste components, circuits, usable circuits, and boards, and putting them together into usable computers, into usable electronics. So they've created this community workshop in a box, this what they call a spacecraft. It's made from all off-the-shelf materials, so there's nothing that has to be made. All of it just needs to be purchased. That can be set up, and it's like a little factory that can be set up anywhere that someone can turn into a business. Now, how do we use this? Camp.net has not become a successful business. In fact, they may never, I hope they do, but they may never become a successful business. But that doesn't reduce the usefulness to us when thinking about the future. Because this single example, which is not a trend, the signal is not modular infrastructure is getting more popular. The signal is not e-waste is a big problem. The signal is specifically camp. And it allows us to tell a story about the future and to think about the future and say, okay, if camp fails now, but there's other things like camp, what would that world look like? And suddenly we have a much more realistic future story that eventually ties back to the present. Another example that's a little bit like this came from, on the forums, from Mohammed Shahethi. He pointed out that IKEA has been making modular farms for hyper-urban areas. They're making modular farms for so that more food can be grown where it's needed to prevent having to transport food long distances. So this is very interesting, both in terms of corporate involvement in humanitarian efforts, in humanitarian projects. So it's giving us there's a story we can tell there about private-public partnerships and the role of the commons. There's also a story there about technology and cheap, lightweight, standardized materials and what that's allowing us to do. And then, of course, it affects one of our forces, which is food insecurity. So it allows us to think about food security and food insecurity and think about, if we have these new tools, does it help us in some way? Does it hurt us in some way? What are the new dangers? What are the new opportunities? When we're telling a future story or a signal, it's usually not useful to argue with the forecast. You should always try and take the forecast on its own terms and say, in a world in which this is true, what would we do? In fact, you'll notice that most signals and most foresight stories can be taken in many different directions. You can have a positive story, negative story, a story of transformation, many different kinds of stories. And this is important. It's not about there being one future, because no one can predict the future. It's about learning to consider many futures in a useful way in order to do what we're doing better. Let's talk about one more signal. Jem, if you could go to the next slide. So this is another one about food. It was a prototype by the World Food Program attempting to use blockchain for better tracking in volatile conditions. So in places where traditional methods of accounting or tracing aid disbursement is difficult, the World Food Program is experimenting with blockchain to see if there's a way to track that disbursement more effectively and use that money more efficiently. This, again, may or may not succeed. Blockchain may or may not be effective for this, but the way that we use this signal, we say, okay, this signal will probably fail. And you'll notice that this is not intended to be a scaled program by the World Food Program. So that fact doesn't make it a less useful signal. But we can think about if there were more effective ways of using distributed computing to track different things, whether that's mangoes or aid disbursement, what would that world look like? And what are the additional dangers? If things are being tracked in a way where they can't be erased later, like with a blockchain, then if we think about that getting applied to a country's credit score, for instance, we might have very unforgiving systems that create a world we don't want to see. So again, a very specific example. The signal is not blockchain. The signal is not the World Food Program has been getting more innovative. The signal is this very specific story. I want to do one more from the forum. Let's see. From Una Hakika, from Camila, the Una Hakika information service managed by the Sentinel Project. They provide information via SMS in response to rumors that may give rise to violence. It acts as an information verification service managed by community volunteers. A very interesting way of using technology and local knowledge for conflict prevention. Indeed. So this one is less about technology. SMS is certainly not a new technology. And it's more instead about a new way of combining in that technology in a creative way. And this is also a common misconception. Sometimes people think that signals have to involve technology, that if it involves drones, then it's a signal. If it involves blockchain, then it's a signal. But the reality is that it's anything that sticks up or is different. And sometimes that doesn't involve technology at all. It can be a new way that people are relating to each other. It can be a new political idea. Anything that is distinct from the everyday, that's a break in the pattern, can be a signal. Okay, so Jem, if we could skip over the next slide and go directly to the one after that. So I want to talk about some foresight methods, some methods of using foresight that you'll have the opportunity to do in the MOOC, and apply to your own organizations and your own projects. And these are tools, they're certainly not the only tools available. I've picked out 3 different tools for us to talk through together here. And this is an example of the kinds of tools you can use to build the future story, the kind of future story that's going to be effective for decision making. I did want to pause just for a moment and invite you to ask any additional questions about signals that you have in the chat or the Q&A before we move forward, so that we can make sure that everyone is clear on that. Because, and we'll talk about how to make a signal, but I want to make sure that everyone is clear on that. So I'll wait just for a moment. And while we're doing that, you can think about whether, if you posted something on the forum that you thought was a signal and have now learned was maybe a trend or a disruption, something new that you might want to post there to share with other folks. Because if we all post signals together and share signals, then it makes telling our future stories more effective. So I'm not seeing anything coming in, which I'm assuming means that we're all on the same page, which is great news. So Jem, if you can move to the next slide. Adam Leach asked, are signals really new? And that's a great question, Adam. Very little in our work is truly new. We're very rarely interested in if something is really, really new. We're more interested in whether something is about to take off. So we are asking questions on a 10-year timeline. So if a technology has really just been created, it's probably not a good signal, because it doesn't tell us an effective future story. It's still too obscure. Kev was asking whether there's ways of combining signals, and there definitely is, and we'll talk about that in the method that comes after this first one, in the 2 curves method. So I have in front of me a worksheet, and what this is about is collecting and clustering signals. So you'll see that when we're doing a signal, when we're making a signal, we want to think about a few different things. One is, what is the signal? And we talked about the important component of this signal, which is that it be as specific as possible. Yeah, Jem, if you could go to the next one. As specific as possible. It should be a small behavior or a project or something like that. And then you want to give it a provocative, pithy title that will attract people and get them thinking about why this signal is important. You can think about it in terms of what and so what. So the what is something short, 1 or 2 sentences. The signal doesn't include, if your signal is the word World Food Program example using blockchain, a signal isn't the World Food Program is using blockchain, and this is a signal because it ties into the future of computing and also the future of food insecurity, and my organization is also using this. All of those things are very important and should come in later in our analysis, but they're not part of creating our signal. Once you have these signals, many of these signals, and you want to collect as many as possible, and ideally in a group. So you'll want to have everyone who's involved in building the future in your organization in the room while you do this, so that you can generate and benefit from the minds of as many people as possible. It's also more effective if you have a specific topic. Some things you see and you know they're a signal just for the world, but signals become easier to pick out if you're applying them to a specific problem or a specific opportunity or a specific organization. Something that's a signal for the humanitarian sector may not be a signal for the corporate sector. Something that's a signal for me sitting in Lagos, Nigeria, may not be a signal for someone sitting in Kenya. So it's important to have a specific framing as well. And once we have these signals, we have as many signals as possible, we can begin to cluster them. And clustering is more of an art than a science. But what you're looking for is commonalities between the different signals. Not necessarily around technology, not necessarily around specific societal buckets. Not this is science and this is humanities. You're looking for new categories to emerge. Like, this one seems to be about logistics that's done in a way that's more broken up and crowdsourced. And this one also kind of involves crowdsourcing. And this one also seems to, and they're all kind of, for some reason, about food, or they're all about youth. And so from that, you start to pick out this new, larger story. And then when you're telling the story, they're connecting back to 5 or 10 or 100 different signals, which gives your story a lot of power when you're using it to think about the future and trying to change your own behavior. Clustering should also be done in groups. If you know you're done clustering when you're able to get it down to between 4 and 5 categories. And this can take a really long time. Usually when we're doing a large forecast for a big organization, we'll start with upwards of 200 signals, and we'll boil that down to sometimes as many as 25 to 40 categories. But we never stop there. We always bucket them and cluster them and talk about the connections more and more until we have 4 or 5 categories that we're satisfied with that allow us to build a future story around them, because that's the kind of story that we find impacts people most strongly. These one way of taking these signals and clustering them, or one way of taking them and combining them in a different way that's not just clustering, is using the 2 curves method. We can use these kind of different methods or storytelling tools in order to create different kinds of future stories depending on the problem that we're trying to solve or what we're trying to communicate. For instance, forecasting the 2 curves is often very useful when we're trying to tell a story of transformation within an organization. When we're trying to get our colleagues and our leadership to understand why they need to act today and what we need to do to get there. So in this forecasting the two curves, we see on the left is today. The left is all about things that are happening today. On the top is today's mainstream, and on the bottom are the signals of change. So we already know what signals are, and in this section on the left, it's going to be easier to talk about the signals than to talk about the mainstream. Because if someone says that something's a signal, it's hard to argue with them. Anything can be a signal. But with today's mainstream, no one wants to be called the mainstream. So if you're in an organization, you say, oh, well, like our accounting practices are mainstream. And the accountant will be like, no, we're not mainstream, we're innovative. So you have to be careful not to get bogged down arguing about what's happening today and to stay as focused as you can on the future. On the right, you see everything about the future. This is our future story. On the top, we have tomorrow's mainstream. So we look at all of our signals of change on the left. We say, if all of these signals come to fruition, if things like this exist in the future, what would that mainstream look like? And then on the bottom is tomorrow's holdovers. What are the things from today's mainstream that are still going to be there for better or for worse? What are the things that are going to be left over when the mainstream changes? So we have here a example of something we used in the Kenya workshop. And this was about food assistance. And so you can see that it doesn't have to look pretty. They have on the top, they have beneficiary identification, logistic processes. And then on the bottom on the left, they have some signals of change. And then on the top, they have tomorrow's mainstream. Looking at those signals, what will come to fruition? And on the bottom, what are the things about today that are going to stay over? If you have sticky notes, those are great. You can also just do this on paper. Use whatever tools you have available. And always, always try and do this in a group. It's almost always more effective. Before I move to the last method that we'll talk about today, I see a couple of questions popping up. So we have someone asking about, what about using your organizational vision as a point of reference to detect signals? And I think that could work. But the danger, perhaps, is that an organizational vision is a future story that you've already created at another time. And one of the values of Foresight methodologies is stress testing or improving that vision so that it tells a story about our future organization that is more provocative and resilient to change. If we use the vision as a point of reference, the danger that we have is building a Foresight story that supports that vision, instead of creating a Foresight story and then asking, is this vision still work given what we now think about the future? And so it might be more effective to use your organization's sector or your organization's greatest challenge as a point of reference. And then you can use that to stress test your vision. You can also use, if you want to build, if your organization is lacking a preferred future, if you think that the vision is not tangible enough, you can start with the vision and use Foresight to make it more realistic and plausible and effective as well. So I guess the answer is depending on what you want to do. We have someone asking about using Foresight for public services instead of for the humanitarian sector. And it's an important question. We often work with cities and governments to think about the future because there's a lot of things in the public sector that only make sense on a long future timeline. The most obvious is infrastructure. You have to be telling a story about the 20 years, 30 years, 50 years into the future every time you build a bridge, every time you want to build a new road, because these are things that are going to be there for decades, but you have to build them today. And so if you're able to tell compelling future stories and to think about future disruptions in a way, you're able to build those things in the present, like infrastructure, that are not easily changed, that require huge capital investment, in order to do them more effectively and to communicate to the public and to your constituency why they are so important. The other element of this is that really collective cooperation outside of individual profit motive really relies on future stories. It's much easier to realize why we organize as a society collectively on a 10-year timeline or a 20-year timeline than it is on a day-to-day timeline, where it makes more sense to kind of fend for yourself. So public services is an important place for strategic foresight. It's also a uniquely opportune industry or sector, I should say, for massively collective foresight. Using foresight methods that collect ideas from hundreds of people, thousands of people. And you can do that even with these methods. If you might need an online platform, or you might need a place that people can send their ideas to aggregate them in a more complex way, because you're sourcing so many ideas. But some of the most exciting foresight work comes out of stuff that involves, 1,000 people or a city. Someone is asking whether there's any possibility of convergence between tomorrow's mainstream and holdovers. We, of course, these things will exist in the same future. So definitely they would be interacting with each other. The reason why we create these distinctions or these buckets, like the future force categories, like the distinction between those two curves, is because it helps us highlight a part of the story that we want to highlight. With the two curves, something the shape emphasizes is this gap, this jump that you have to make. And you'll notice that if you want to make it from the first curve to the second curve, you have to jump before it's too far down, or you will never make it. And that's before it reaches midway. So you have to realize that you need to jump before the curve is at its steepest point. And that's really important for an organization, because it's really hard to make the jump, because often you have a lot of success on the way down. It's something that you're really good at. It's something you've been doing for years. You have funding streams for it. And so making the jump to something new takes a lot of work and a lot of risk. And so this storyline shape helps us articulate that. So I want to move to the last method, so that we have some time at the end for Q&A. This final method is about riding the two curves. And you'll notice that we have different kinds. So Jem, next slide. You'll notice that this is an insight as opposed to a foresight, as opposed to a foresight exercise. We think about everything that we do in terms of the foresight, insight, action cycle. Foresight, a plausible, internally consistent, provocative story of the future, leads, if it's a good foresight, to effective insight. An aha moment, something that changes the way you think. And an insight is a little different from an idea. If you have an insight, you can't go back. So this is a method that helps us take our foresight and move it to insights for our organization. So if we were working on this method, we would have first done a signals exercise. Then we would have taken those signals and we would have applied it to the two curves to tell a Foresight story. And it's only then that we try to think about what it means for our organization. If you jump to doing that too early, then you can lose a lot of the value. So you see we have our two curves again. And on the top left, we have today's business model. Again, don't get bogged down arguing about what this business model is, because there will be a lot of different opinions, especially in a large organization. And then on the left, we have today's innovations. These are often internal signals, things that are coming within your organization. And then on the right, we have the future. But instead of it being about the future, we say, in this future that exists, how does this apply to our organization? So you're taking a foresight and you're using this tool to apply insights. Okay, so I wanted to ask you all a question. Jem, next slide. Now that you've had a chance to look at the MOOC and to hear a little bit in this webinar, I'd be curious to know, how are you going to use Foresight methods? Are you going to use it to adapt the way you currently plan and implement your work, develop strategies for your organization, or for helping other organizations? So in other words, are you going to use this for yourself, for your organization, or for the ecosystem? And of course, it might be a combination of all three, but I'd be curious what your major pain point is. I'm going to select helping organizations because that's what I'm in the middle of right now. Great. It seems like most people are using this for developing strategies for their organization and helping many people are going to be helping other organizations. Oh, I'm so happy to see that, because Foresight is especially rich when it's done in partnership with others, and often with diverse actors or partners that are not doing the same thing that you do. However, even if you're doing work for your organization around Foresight, it is helpful to bring it back to yourself. Some of our recent research has shown that if you think about yourself in the future, it stimulates a part of your brain that helps you think about the future more effectively. So instead of talking about autonomous vehicles and their future in an abstract way, think about yourself getting into that autonomous vehicle. How old are you when you're doing that? Do you have children when you're doing that? Are you taking care of your parents while you're doing that? Where are you going in that autonomous vehicle? All of a sudden, you're working with a different part of your brain than when you think about it abstractly. I want to leave you with one last thing. Next slide, Jem, which is some elements of stories that can help you provoke radical behavior change for yourself. And this comes from a researcher named Kendall Haven, who studies the neuroscience of stories. So he was studying this for the research arm of the US Defense Department to figure out how they could tell stories that would promote peace in different places. And using a lot of sensor data, he found that these elements provoked radical behavior change in people. Your story should answer, who is this story about for me or for us? For a lot of people, this is their kids. For other people, this is their country. For other people, this is their organization. Who's the story really about, this future story? How bad is the story for that character? And yes, he does say that you should think about the problem, which doesn't mean you can't end optimistically, but including the problem in your future story in a tangible way provokes that behavior change. 3, who is responsible? I always try to make myself responsible in the future stories, but sometimes it's just not the case. Sometimes really another organization is responsible, or collectively responsible for climate change, or the government is responsible for performing certain actions. And then 4 is, what should I do, or what should we do together in order to make this happen? And if you use these tips and build your story around them, you can help promote behavior change in yourself and in others. So I want to leave the last few minutes that we have together to open it up for some more questions about Foresight, about me, about our work here generally. And yeah, thank you again for joining us all today.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Again, as we have about 5 minutes more, but we would love to hear any final questions. And again, if there are any other questions that you think about beyond the webinar, we can also continue some of the discussions on the forum.
Yes, definitely. Okay, great.
If there aren't any questions, maybe Jeremy, I might. Okay, I think I do see one.
Yeah, it looks like Camila says, in your experience, how long has it taken you to convince people that Foresight is a worthwhile method to apply? And it's a very good question. Often people come to us when the hardest part is when people come to us when it's already too late. If my work is with a company, then often it's because they're a big company and they thought that nothing could ever affect them or touch them. And then some startup gets really big, or other players enter the industry and they realize that they really have to get their game up. It's really hard to start working from that footing, although it's not impossible. The best time is actually when people are in a good place and you have extra resources to dedicate toward crises not becoming disasters, we should say. The best time to realize that you should build your house out of wood instead of bricks is before an earthquake, not after. And convincing people about the worth of Foresight is about communicating to them the value to them in terms of what they're already working on and applying it to their everyday work. So if that's for someone working in organizing people or in human resources, then communicating to them about how Foresight can help them get out ahead of possible organizational problems, and how Foresight can help align the organization around a common goal and a shared language. If that person is managing public constituency, it's about communicating to them how Foresight can help them tell better stories about what they're trying to do. So the core value is always either resiliency to disruption or opportunity. So if someone's facing a lot of disruption and crisis in what they're doing, you could probably talk with them about how to help them be more resilient to future disruptions. And if they're doing well, you can talk about how it can help them expand their opportunities.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeremy. I think we will start to wrap up there. I might hand over to Lisa just very quickly to talk a little bit about next steps with the course for the participants. So over to you, Lisa. And thanks so much again, Jeremy, for your wonderful presentation and for the methods that you shared as well.
And thank you so much to you all at the Humanitarian Leadership Academy and kayakconnect.org for putting this together. And I'll be active on the forums if you all have anything else you want to talk to me about.
Okay, yes, I quickly want to throw in a small comment. Don't forget to do all the activities that are in the MOOC. Don't forget to finish up the last modules. And get that badge and get that certificate. You can add it to a folder, you can add it to LinkedIn. So keep being active in the last few days on the forums, keep sharing, as Jeremy said. If we all share together, more ideas will pop up. So I continue to look forward to working with you through the MOOC.
Great, thanks so much, Lisa, and thanks again, everyone, for attending. The webinar as well was recorded, so for those colleagues of yours who could not attend, the recording will also be available on the course in the coming days. But thank you very much for your participation, and thanks to Jem as well for hosting. Have a great day, everyone. Bye bye.